the $4.1 billion mistake. They fired me in the middle of a $4.1 billion negotiation. Not before we sat down, not after the ink was dry, but right in the middle. I am Donovan Vance, 55 years old, and I just watched 18 years of painstaking relationship building get completely torched in front of a room full of Saudi dignitaries, American corporate lawyers, and a 26-year-old vice president who could not tell the difference between formal Arabic and casual street slang. The young woman at the end of the table, a recently hired corporate assistant named Clara, will be handling all translations and compliance moving forward, Julian Thorne said, casually gesturing toward her. The very next sentence, from Sheikh Tariq of Al-Qasimi Enterprises, came through her earpiece completely broken and half-translated. The rest of the Sheikh's profound statement just died in the sterile air of the boardroom. They did not even have the professional courtesy to wait until the meeting was fully adjourned. Donovan Julian leaned forward across the expansive polished mahogany table, his voice carrying an undeniable edge of arrogance. Your position is no longer needed. Human Resources is waiting to meet you downstairs in the lobby. I thought I had heard him wrong for a split second. The translation headset was still warm in my hands. Mere moments before, I had finished relaying a critical, highly nuanced statement from the chief negotiator of Al-Qasimi Enterprises, one that could have unequivocally sealed the $4.1 billion logistics expansion deal. Now, every single pair of eyes in that high-stakes environment was deadlocked on me. Just a week ago, Julian had pulled me aside after a grueling late-night preparation session. You will be right there next to me for the signing, Donovan, he had said with a firm pat on my shoulder. This is going to be a historic day for Vanguard Logistics. I had foolishly believed him. For 18 long years, I had believed that corporate loyalty worked in both directions. I was the senior director of Middle East operations at Vanguard Logistics. But that impressive title did not even begin to tell the real story of my daily life. I was the foundational bridge between this massive American corporation and the entire Gulf region. I was the only executive who spoke fluent Arabic, understanding not just the vocabulary, but the deep cultural contexts. Deals involving hundreds of millions of dollars lived or died on a single, carefully translated phrase I delivered to our partners. I had worked through countless midnight phone calls, navigated severe cultural misunderstandings that could have offended royal families, endured tense silences during price negotiations, and secured handshake agreements that no corporate lawyer could ever properly draft. I had done 3 consecutive tours in military intelligence, stationed in Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan from 1993 to 2005. During those 12 years, I built genuine relationships that normally take several decades to properly cultivate. Those deep connections seamlessly became this company's absolute biggest asset when I transitioned into the private sector in 2006. My reward for all of this dedication was a completely unceremonious public execution in the exact middle of the most important negotiation in the company's history. Julian Thorne was everything that I was not. He was a freshly minted Master of Business Administration graduate from an Ivy League university who wore suits that cost more than a reliable used car. He valued rapid speed over careful precision and rigid templates over authentic human relationships. Where I saw complex individuals with unique histories, he only saw leverage points and financial metrics. Where I heard deeply layered cultural meaning in a conversation, he merely heard excess words that needed to be aggressively cut down for operational efficiency. And now, in front of our most important global client, he had decisively concluded that my 18 years of expertise was entirely replaceable by a junior assistant and a translation application. Sheikh Tariq's composed expression barely shifted, but I noticed the subtle tightening of his jaw. He looked from Clara, the terrified assistant, back to me, silently confirming the catastrophic change that had just occurred. I leaned forward, looked Julian dead in the eye, and said one thing in English. You just voided the entire compliance framework. You better check with the legal department. Julian simply waved his hand at me dismissively. We will handle it, he sneered. I calmly picked up my leather notebook, stood up from my chair, and looked directly at the sheikh. Switching perfectly to Arabic, I placed my right hand over my heart and said, "Tariq, it has been the greatest honor of my professional life to work with your esteemed family." The sheikh immediately stood up. He did not extend his hand to Julian. He did not say a word to the American delegation. He simply watched with a stoic expression as I turned around and walked out of the boardroom. Let me back up and tell you exactly how I got to this absurd point in my life. From 1993 to 2005, I served in military intelligence. That title always sounds much cooler in movies than it was in reality. Mostly, my job consisted of sitting in sweltering, dust-filled rooms with local tribal leaders, drinking bitter tea, and slowly learning that the man who talks the absolute most in the room is usually the one who knows the absolute least. I learned to speak Arabic not from a textbook, but from a 65-year-old local translator named Fahad. He taught me something profound that the military academy simply could not. He taught me that genuine respect earns significantly more cooperation than military rank ever will. He taught me that a solid handshake means exponentially more than a 50-page contract printed on heavy paper. He taught me that your word is your ultimate bond, and if you break it, you lose your honor forever. That specific training saved far more lives than any tactical weapon we carried. I remember one exceptionally tense afternoon in Fallujah back in 2004. We had a volatile tribal dispute over land rights that was about to literally blow up into a violent confrontation. Our heavily armed convoy was stuck right in the middle of the escalating tension. My commanding officer wanted to just aggressively push our way through the blockade. I calmly told him to give me exactly 10 minutes to defuse the situation. I walked unarmed into the center of the road, sat down in the dirt with both tribal elders, and simply listened. I did not argue. I did not try to forcefully negotiate. I just listened to their grievances. Then, I quietly quoted an old regional proverb that Fahad had taught me about how the truly wise man plants trees whose cooling shade he knows he will never personally sit under. Both of the angry elders went completely quiet. They stopped yelling and started actually talking to each other rather than screaming at each other. Exactly 30 minutes later, the disputed road was totally clear. Our entire convoy moved safely through the area without a single shot being fired by either side. When I finally left the military in 2005, I carried something that most corporate executives did not even know existed. I had real, tested relationships in the Gulf region, not superficial networking connections, but real, unbreakable trust. That is precisely why Vanguard Logistics recruited me in 2006 to aggressively build their Middle East division completely from scratch. I was 35 years old at the time. I had no advanced business degree, no traditional corporate experience, just an extensive mental Rolodex full of powerful names and a rock-solid reputation for always keeping my word. The first 3 years at Vanguard Logistics were incredibly slow and painfully frustrating. I was not instantly closing billion-dollar deals or making front-page corporate news. Instead, I was drinking countless cups of strong coffee in small offices across Dubai and flying to Riyadh for high-level meetings that seemingly went nowhere for months at a time. I was patiently building the essential foundations of trust. Corporate headquarters back in the United States absolutely did not understand my methodology. They aggressively demanded immediate results, constantly asking for updated quarterly financial numbers and rapidly expanding revenue projections. I kept repeatedly telling the executive board that this specific region simply does not operate like this. Genuine trust takes immense time to build, and it cannot be rushed by an impatient accounting department. Then, my 5th year at the company happened, and everything changed overnight. We were sitting in a heavily air-conditioned office in Riyadh. The expansive room smelled deeply of rich cardamom coffee and brand new leather furniture. The massive contract sitting on the table was worth exactly $800 million for a comprehensive defense logistics network. But the negotiation was slipping away incredibly fast. Our lead American negotiator, a man who had never left the United States before this trip, cluelessly compared the intricate deal to a wild camel chasing the setting sun. In his native English, he thought it sounded profoundly poetic. However, in Arabic, and particularly in that specific local dialect, the phrase translated to mean a complete fool desperately chasing something he would never actually catch. I saw the dangerous flicker of deep insult flash instantly in the powerful chairman's eyes. The massive deal was literally seconds away from collapsing entirely. I did not ask for permission from my superiors. I simply stepped forward, laughed softly in a respectful manner, and spoke in perfect Arabic. I gently corrected the metaphor, saying that it is always better to be a camel chasing the warm sun than to be a wealthy merchant sitting in the cold without any shade. It was a very old, highly respected saying from his specific home province, a subtle nod to ambition coupled with inherent dignity. The tension in the entire room instantly shifted, and I physically saw the rigid shoulders of the Saudi delegation relax. The chairman chuckled warmly, loudly repeated my exact phrase, and remarkably signed the preliminary agreement right there on the spot. I had personally saved an $800 million deal in exactly 5 seconds. Naturally, that incredible story never made its way into the official quarterly corporate report. My name was conveniently left off the internal success memorandum. All the credit went directly to the vague concept of team effort, which was just corporate language for giving the executives at the head of the table the massive financial bonuses. That incident was not just a one-time occurrence either. Over the next decade, I constantly untangled severe mistranslations and complex customs regulations. I personally kept $90 million in perishable goods from being legally seized at various shipping ports. I completely restructured dozens of sensitive contract clauses to simultaneously honor both strict United States corporate law and traditional Islamic banking principles. I sat through countless long Ramadan nights, staying awake until dawn to ensure that our critical midnight conference calls landed at exactly the right respectful moment in Mecca's local time zone. 18 full years of doing this exhausting work, carrying a massive American company's fragile trust across difficult languages, multiple continents, and vastly different cultures. Every single major win was boldly stamped with the company's grand name, not mine. Every massive problem I quietly solved instantly disappeared into someone else's polished resume. Then Julian Thorne arrived at Vanguard Logistics. 2 years ago, he swept into our corporate headquarters like a bold headline in a prestigious financial magazine. He had an Ivy League degree, wore perfectly tailored designer suits, and carried a resume that made our naive board members smile with absolute delight. He had been specifically brought in to aggressively modernize our international operations. To Julian, the concept of modernization simply meant completely stripping away anything that he could not neatly categorize in an Excel spreadsheet. To him, foreign language fluency was merely decorative, nice to have but totally unnecessary if you possessed airtight contract templates. To Julian, deep personal relationships were just outdated corporate relics, much slower than efficient email chains and far less reliable than binding legal clauses. Our first genuinely explosive clash came during a routine draft review for a massive new partnership in Baronside. Julian arrogantly skimmed through the critical Arabic section of the contract like it was a total afterthought. He rapidly signed the draft and sent it to the legal department for finalization. What he absolutely did not know was that the translated document mistakenly referred to a strictly prohibited financial practice under regional law. The contract would have been aggressively rejected immediately, potentially blacklisting our company in the area. I miraculously caught the glaring error on my way out of the office. I quietly rewrote the entire section, carefully rephrasing the financial terms to fully comply with all regional compliance standards. I then resent the corrected draft under his name to save the deal. Julian never even asked how the final version passed the legal review so smoothly. I heavily doubt he even realized I had touched the document. The deal went through flawlessly. The company earned millions of dollars, and absolutely no one lost face. But it mattered deeply to me because the very next week I overheard him talking in the boardroom. The heavy door was left half open. "We are streamlining," Julian was saying to the board, his voice dripping with condescension. "Too many moving parts severely slow down our operational efficiency. People like Donovan have good intentions, but they get hopelessly bogged down in the minute details. We simply do not need to hold our clients' hands through these archaic cultural quirks. We just need their signatures on the dotted line. I stood frozen in the hallway. Good intentions, minute details, archaic cultural quirks. He had just callously reduced 18 years of my painstaking bridge building to mere quirks. I did not walk into the room to confront him. What would be the point? But I etched every single word he said into my memory. A week later, I caught him alone in the executive conference room after standard business hours. "Julian, we desperately need to talk," I said firmly. He looked up, clearly annoyed by my presence. "Donovan, I am running very late for the Bahrain contract celebration dinner." He sighed. "You almost killed that entire deal," I told him bluntly. "The contract contained a severe regional legal prohibition on line 47. I completely rewrote it for you. You never even noticed the change." His arrogant face went completely blank for a moment. "What exactly are you saying, Donovan?" he demanded. "I am saying that you do not know what you do not know," I replied coldly. "And that level of ignorance is extremely dangerous when you are carelessly playing with billions of dollars." I turned around and walked out, leaving him standing there in stunned silence. It did not feel particularly good, but it felt absolutely necessary. From that exact moment on, every single interaction with Julian felt like walking a dangerous tightrope. He aggressively pushed for reckless speed. I quietly ensured flawless accuracy. He sent out critical legal documents that were only half read. I aggressively caught the disastrous errors before they became public relations nightmares. He confidently carried himself like the brilliant mastermind, pulling all the corporate strings, never once noticing the calloused hands that were actively keeping the entire operation from collapsing into dust. Then came the massive Al-Qasimi deal, worth exactly $4.1 billion. It included immense petroleum logistics contracts, sprawling supply chain commitments, and highly sensitive technology transfer agreements. These were staggering numbers that completely stopped feeling real to anyone outside the executive suite. I had been deeply embedded in every single step of the grueling process. Not merely because my corporate title strictly required it, but because without my active presence, the entire deal simply could not move forward. Al-Qasimi Enterprises possessed a rigorous corporate compliance protocol that was just as much about establishing deep mutual respect as it was about strict risk management. Every single major phase of the binding agreement required absolute verification from the formally designated primary compliance officer. That designated officer was me. It was not just a simple administrative signature on a piece of paper. It was a rigorous legal verification of trust, deeply embedded into international trade compliance laws. Removing the formally designated compliance officer right in the middle of the complex process would be exactly like abruptly swapping a groom at the altar during a wedding ceremony. I took this immense responsibility incredibly seriously. Weeks before the highly anticipated final signing, I had begun preparing far more than just standard legal translations. I had personally commissioned a beautiful, handcrafted inlaid wooden box from a highly respected artisan in Riyadh, exactly the kind traditionally used for storing priceless family heirlooms. Inside this beautiful box, I placed rare premium dates, carefully wrapped in beautiful gold-threaded cloth. It was not just a simple corporate gift. It was a very powerful, culturally significant signal that Vanguard Logistics deeply understood and respected their ancient traditions. Alongside the thoughtful gift, I wrote a deeply respectful speech, entirely in flawless Arabic. It was not the sterile, literal, word-for-word translation that Julian always preferred. It was something deeply personal. It seamlessly wove in regional proverbs, respectful references to our long-shared history, and subtle but powerful affirmations of deep mutual respect. It was exactly the kind of genuine address that could make a powerful chairman feel not just financially valued, but personally remembered and respected. Still, despite my extensive preparations, I knew far better than to ever assume anything in corporate America was guaranteed. That is exactly why, late one evening while meticulously reviewing the master contract, I carefully read a critical clause buried extremely deep in the dense legal language. It was an essential party continuity and compliance provision. If the specifically named compliance liaison was abruptly removed or replaced before the final authorization sequence was complete, The entire agreement would automatically terminate, becoming void ab initio under strict international trade laws. There would be absolutely no room for renegotiations and no permitted delays. The contract would just become instantly legally void. I intentionally did not mention this critical clause to Julian, not because I maliciously wanted the deal to fail, but because I had learned a very valuable lesson over the years. Real corporate power does not always come from making loud, aggressive threats. Sometimes true power simply comes from knowing exactly where the floor is and watching closely to see who is foolishly standing too close to the dangerous edge. It is an old, reliable rule that I learned during my military days in Kabul. Never ever interrupt an arrogant enemy when he is busy making a catastrophic mistake. The very next morning, during a tense preparation session, Julian abruptly dismissed my proposed Arabic speech as being far too long and far too overly sentimental. I simply smiled calmly and slid my carefully written notes back into my leather folder. I let him confidently talk about his rigid contract templates and his beloved efficiency metrics. He did not even notice that I was not arguing with him. Inside my mind, I knew a massive legal fact that he did not. That quiet knowledge was more than enough for me. Thursday began exactly like any other high-stakes negotiation day. My morning coffee had already gone completely cold beside heavily annotated legal contracts. By 3:42 in the afternoon, the air inside the boardroom felt noticeably heavier. Maybe that was just my trained instincts sensing the massive shift right before it actually happened. I sat quietly in my designated seat and watched as the impressive Al-Qasimi delegation finally settled in, their expensive gold cufflinks catching the bright overhead light. Sitting right beside Julian was Clara, the terrified assistant, nervously clutching my beautiful inlaid wooden box like it was a completely misplaced theatrical prop. I had spent countless weeks carefully choosing that meaningful gift, meticulously crafting the exact respectful words that should accompany it. Now, those powerful words were clumsily sitting in her trembling hands, printed out in my careful Arabic script. Julian confidently cleared his throat, attempting to command the room. "Before we formally begin the final legal review, we have a small presentation," he announced loudly. Clara nervously stood up. She began to read directly from my printed pages. The natural rhythm of the beautiful language faltered almost immediately in her untrained mouth. A severely misplaced vowel completely changed the meaning of lasting trust into a phrase resembling delayed trust. Another brutal mispronunciation made the concept of honored partnership sound awkwardly like burdened partnership. I visibly saw the deep confusion instantly ripple through the entire Al-Qasimi side of the table. Sideways glances were rapidly exchanged. Sheikh Tariq's thick brows noticeably tightened when Clara awkwardly presented the wooden box to him. The powerful, respectful moment I had envisioned was already completely gone, destroyed by sheer incompetence. The Sheikh politely accepted the box with the tight, reserved smile he strictly reserved for complete strangers. He did not open it. He did not respond with the customary respectful phrase that would normally signal deep mutual goodwill. The heavy silence that followed was brief, but it completely filled the massive room. Then, Julian slowly turned his arrogant face toward me. "Donovan, could you please step outside into the hallway for a moment?" he asked smoothly. I quietly pushed my chair back and followed him out into the cold hallway. The head of human resources was already standing there, waiting at the end of the corridor, holding a thick white envelope in her hands. "This termination is effective immediately," Julian said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "We appreciate your past contributions." The words were incredibly crisp and aggressively bureaucratic. There was absolutely no acknowledgement of my 18 years of tireless service, and absolutely no mention of the crucial role I had played in actually getting our company to this massive table. When we re-entered the boardroom so that I could quietly collect my personal belongings, every single eye in the room was fixed on me. I maintained absolute composure. I categorically refused to give Julian the distinct satisfaction of seeing my hands shake. I simply packed my bag and walked away. That night, I sat alone in my quiet apartment, listening to the muffled city noise outside my window. I poured myself a single glass of bourbon. Somewhere in a highly secure corporate server located thousands of miles away, The automated compliance system handling the massive Al-Qasimi agreement was already actively processing my sudden absence. Their strict corporate compliance protocol absolutely did not care about Julian's impressive job titles or his arrogant reasons for removing me. The legal system only cared about absolute continuity and strict compliance. My name had been deeply hard-coded into the massive agreement as the sole primary compliance liaison. Every single legal step, from the very first handshake to the final electronic signature, had been inextricably tied to my verified identity and my specific legal authorization. When Human Resources officially removed my name from Vanguard Logistics Employee Directory, it was not just a simple line of text on a spreadsheet disappearing into the void. It was a massive legal trigger. Julian, in his extreme arrogance and absolute desperation to finalize the deal and secure his massive bonus, realized that the electronic compliance system strictly required my final authorization signature to proceed. Because I was already gone, he foolishly decided to bypass the system entirely. He used his administrative executive access to illegally forge my electronic signature on the final Arabic compliance documents, approving the $4.1 billion contract on my behalf. He actually thought no one would ever notice. He thought he was just streamlining a minor administrative bottleneck. At 8:47 in the evening, my personal phone buzzed. It was an encrypted automated notification from the legal system. The message consisted of a single line. Primary compliance officer removed. Protocol 9 engaged. There were no lengthy explanations, no corporate dramatics, just the cold, absolute precision of international trade law being followed. Protocol 9 meant the immediate, automatic suspension of all pending contract authorizations until a fully qualified, legally verified liaison replaced the formally removed party. Given the extremely strict legal terms I had read in the fine print, that incredibly complex replacement process would take several weeks to complete, if it even happened at all. But Julian's forgery had complicated things drastically. By illegally signing my name, he had committed a massive federal crime. I set my phone down on the table. My heart was not racing. My old military training simply kicked inside. This was not petty revenge in the dramatic cinematic sense. There were no grand sweeping declarations, and absolutely no childish public humiliation. This was a quiet, absolutely inevitable consequence written deeply into the very bones of the legal agreement they had been so eager to rush. At 9:13 in the evening, my phone buzzed again-side. It was a highly secure private message from a junior associate at Al-Qasimi Enterprises, whom I had known for many years. The encrypted message was incredibly short. "Tomorrow morning will be very interesting." I read the message twice, then completely powered my phone off. "In the Gulf region, your given word is your absolute bond. Break that bond just once, and you are completely done forever." I quietly watched the distant city lights blur against the dark night sky. In just a few short hours, powerful people sitting in expensive corner offices would start to panic. Emergency meetings would be frantically called. Words like irreversible and disastrous would begin to circulate rapidly. I would not need to say a single word. By the time most of Vanguard Logistics staff were pouring their first cups of morning coffee, the massive financial damage was already in motion. I was sitting barefoot at my kitchen table, quietly watching the pale morning sunlight slowly creep across the wood grain when the very first alert hit my laptop. At 9:15 in the morning, Al-Qasimi Enterprises officially announced that they were completely withdrawing from the $4.1 billion agreement with Vanguard Logistics. Their press release specifically cited a severe breach of contract continuity and massive compliance irregularities. The public language used was highly diplomatic, expressing deep regret over completely unforeseen administrative circumstances, but the underlying meaning was absolutely razor-sharp. The financial market understood the disastrous implications immediately. Within minutes of the announcement, Vanguard stock rapidly dropped 4%, then plummeted to 6%. By the time I refreshed my browser window again, it had violently slid past 8%. I sipped my hot coffee slowly. The corporate world outside was incredibly loud and chaotic, but my apartment was dead silent. At 9:32 in the morning, the first major financial news outlet published their detailed analysis. They clearly broke down the strict compliance removal clause in incredibly plain language for their readers. If the designated compliance liaison is abruptly removed mid-process, the entire deal automatically self-terminates. There is absolutely no room for any corporate appeal. There are zero exceptions. The damning article spread incredibly fast across the internet. Powerful Wall Street investors absolutely did not like the terrifying idea of a massive corporation missing something so incredibly fundamental, especially in a deal of this staggering size. Damaging words like gross oversight and executive negligence started appearing boldly in major headlines. I clearly imagined Julian's jaw tightening aggressively as he read them. I pictured the furious chief executive officer pacing violently in his office phones ringing constantly without a single pause. Then the absolute worst thing possible happened for Julian. The legal reality of his desperate forgery finally surfaced. A whistleblower within Vanguard's own legal department realized that my electronic signature had been actively applied to the compliance documents, hours after I had been officially terminated and locked out of the corporate network. Under California Penal Code Section 470, forging a signature on a binding legal contract renders the entire document void ab initio, which essentially means it is completely void right from the absolute beginning. Because the contract was based on a severely forged compliance document, the entire $4.1 billion deal was not just canceled, it was totally illegal. The company was now facing a massive federal investigation for violating strict international trade laws. Julian had not just lost a massive corporate deal. He had committed a major felony. By 11:30 in the morning, the stock had aggressively dropped another 2%. The total financial damage was a staggering 10% drop in under 3 hours. My professional network was aggressively lighting up with messages. Former colleagues, powerful industry contacts, and people I had not heard from in several years were all desperately reaching out. Everyone was frantically asking the exact same question: what in the world just happened? I categorically refused to respond to any of them. I remembered an old reliable rule from my days in Baghdad. When your arrogant enemy is violently drowning, absolutely do not throw them a rescue rope. Do not throw them a heavy anchor either. Just quietly step back and let the basic laws of physics do their necessary work. By late Friday morning, the major news headlines stopped being solely about the failed deal and actively started focusing heavily on severe leadership failures and impending legal investigations. The corporate board of directors called an immediate emergency session. Massive investors furiously patched into the call from 3 different continents. I was not physically in the room, but I had been in enough of those intense meetings over the past 18 years to accurately picture the chaos. I could visualize the long mahogany table, the tight-lipped, furious directors, and the massive wall of muted video feeds showing angry faces framed by the bright glow of their expensive home offices. The pointed questions would be razor-sharp, the angry voices would be heavily clipped, and absolutely no time would be wasted on basic politeness. Reports later confirmed exactly what I had imagined. The chief executive officer was heavily pressed first. How could a massive legal continuity clause that basic have been so carelessly overlooked? Why had the formally designated compliance liaison been abruptly removed at the absolute final stage of a $4.1 billion negotiation? He hopelessly fumbled through a pathetic answer about necessary operational restructuring. Then, the board aggressively turned all their focused fury toward Julian. Why had he replaced the only legally verified, fully fluent compliance expert during a critical negotiation? And much more importantly, how did my electronic signature magically appear on the compliance documents hours after my network access was permanently revoked? His desperate reply about streamlining corporate processes was met with absolute, deafening silence. Then, a single devastating question came from one of our absolute largest Middle Eastern investors. The powerful investor asked Julian if he even knew who Al-Qasimi actually trusted in that boardroom. It certainly was not Julian, it never had been. Several of those massive investors had worked closely with me personally over the years. They clearly remembered the long, late-night phone calls, the incredibly careful translations, and the unique way I could effortlessly untangle a severe cultural misunderstanding before it disastrously turned into a massive insult. To them, I was never just an ordinary employee. I was the sturdy bridge that made their incredibly lucrative business possible. And now, that essential bridge was entirely gone, destroyed by Julian's arrogance and subsequent felony forgery. Word reached me by early afternoon. Julian had been strictly ordered by the board to reach out to me directly, not the chief executive officer, not human resources, but Julian himself. I absolutely did not answer when my phone rang. I intentionally did not return his first desperate text message, nor did I return the second. I just let the heavy silence do all the heavy lifting. At 10:47 on Saturday morning, my phone finally rang with a number I distinctly recognized. I answered it. Julian's voice was shaking. "We desperately need you back, Donovan," he pleaded. "Please, just name your price," I responded coldly. "It is absolutely not about the price, Julian. It is about a fundamental handshake that you completely failed to understand and a severe federal crime that you cannot undo." I abruptly hung up the phone. I did not bother to block his number. I just calmly set the phone down and went back to enjoying my coffee. By Saturday afternoon, the company's stock had violently dropped another 2%. The total financial damage was a devastating 12% drop over just 2 short days. The massive market cap was down roughly $2.4 billion. The brutal math was incredibly simple. The original $4.1 billion deal simply represented future revenue. But the unforgiving financial market was now actively pricing in something significantly bigger: risk. The extreme risk that Vanguard Logistics no longer safely understood how to conduct legal business in the Gulf region, and the massive legal liability of having an executive actively forging signatures. The board made their decisive move on Monday morning. A press release went out at exactly 9 in the morning. Julian Thorne was officially terminated for severe cause, completely stripped of all his corporate stock options, and actively referred to federal authorities for investigation regarding the forged documents. His rapid career was entirely over at the young age of 26. A massive corporate watch list severely flagged Vanguard Logistics, meaning no reputable company in the Gulf would ever trust them again. Vanguard eventually lost an estimated $5 billion in other projected contracts over the next 3 years. I did not gloat, and I did not post any dramatic stories on social media. I just waited patiently. 3 weeks later, a formal invitation arrived via secure courier. Al-Qasimi Enterprises wanted me at their New York headquarters. When I arrived, Sheikh Tariq warmly offered me a massive position as their chief advisor for North American operations, complete with a $600,000 annual retainer and a massive equity stake. More importantly, I had complete autonomy. As we shook hands to finalize the agreement, the sheikh smiled and spoke in perfect Arabic. "The remarkably patient man eventually eats the ripe fruit," he said warmly. "The incredibly hasty man only eats broken stones." I smiled back, deeply knowing that I had just successfully secured my entire future. I was no longer carrying other people's massive corporate wins on my tired back. I was finally building a lasting legacy that proudly had my own name on it, and I was never ever looking back.